Hi friends, so to finish up real quick where we left off in the 5th century, when the last video on the priesthood abruptly ended, in the 5th century in 451 AD was the Council of Chalcedon, and at the Council of Chalcedon was really the first major division of the church that never healed, although fortunately there are talks about reconciliation currently going on. But anyway, the non-Chalcedonians, the Oriental Orthodox, of which I am a member, we went on our own way. And we continued on our own way for the last 1600 years. Well, something that bothered me, because back when I was a Presbyterian, I kept being told that a lot of doctrines about the sacraments, priesthood, etc. were very late developments, 8th, 9th century developments that then ended up being in both the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholics after the split in 1000, but that they were not there in the earliest churches. What kept bothering me was I knew that the Oriental Orthodox existed. And if the Oriental Orthodox existed, and they had a priesthood, and connected to that priesthood sacraments, and they hadn't been getting along with the Chalcedonians until very recently, for 1600 years, to the point where there are reports of non-Chalcedonians who, when they saw their family members taking the Chalcedonian Eucharist, forcibly grabbed their throats and forced them to choke up the Chalcedonian Eucharist. Now, I'm not saying that's a good idea. I'm saying these people were not getting along. They weren't borrowing ideas from each other. While there were talks for a couple hundred years, kind of tense talks, about maybe getting back together, centuries and centuries of division and separation well before the 8th and 9th century. We're talking in the 400s, mid-400s. So if anything developed, you would have to demonstrate that it developed before the 400s. You can't say it was an 8th or 9th century development. And the three apostolic churches that come from the Chalcedonian split and that council are the Oriental Orthodox, and then the Roman Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox, the two branches from the split in 1054, when the Chalcedonian church itself permanently divided. There was a short division over the 3 chapters, but that was among the Chalcedonians, but that was healed. But anyway, all 3 of those churches have a priesthood. They have bishops. They have priests who are the assistants to the bishops in their own parishes. They have deacons. They have subdeacons, readers, chanters. They have very similar, sometimes basically identical priestly vestments. They have altar servers. They have an altar where the sacrifice of the Mass is offered by priests according to the order of Melchizedek, in what they all refer to as an unbloody sacrifice of the Mass. This shows that all the orders were regular and were universal by the middle of the 5th century. Even the ones that developed over time, and the aspects of the priesthood that developed over time. Subdeacons, okay, that very likely developed over the first couple centuries of Christianity. The first clear reference that I've seen personally to a subdeacon is in the middle of the 3rd century with the death of Cyprian. The kind of separation between chanter and reader, that might have developed We know that bishops going from being in each local parish with multiple priests around them to being over a diocese with one priest surrounded by deacons in each parish, we know that that was a development that took some time. It started in the middle of the 3rd century and going into the 4th century. And so we know that those things were developments. But all of that clearly developed by the time of Chalcedon. And one thing that I think is really lacking in a lot of Protestant arguments against a priesthood and against sacraments, which go along with a priesthood, is not taking seriously the fact that the non-Chalcedonians have the same priesthood and the same sacraments as the apostolic Chalcedonian churches. And while there were talks for a couple hundred years about maybe getting back together, even those talks were tense, and for well over 1,000 years, for about 1,500 years, the non-Chalcedonians and Chalcedonians were not getting along at all, and were throwing anathemas at each other. So that evidence needs to be dealt with. But here's the catch. This is what happened to me as a Presbyterian. When you deal with that evidence, when you deal with the issue of non-Chalcedonians having the same sacraments and priesthood as the Chalcedonians, and you recognize that all those things, whether they're from the beginning or the parts that developed, were fully intact by the middle of the 5th century, then you start asking other questions. When you start asking other questions, start digging deeper, look at the 4th century material like Cyril of Jerusalem, Ambrose of Milan, look at the 3rd century material, so you go back to the very beginning of the 3rd century with Hippolytus, who was calling the bishops the high priest. And for that matter, it was just kind of common in the earliest centuries to refer to the bishop as the high priest, to refer to the deacon as the Levites, to talk about an altar, to talk about the sacrifice of the Mass. This was not something that slowly developed. A priesthood, not just the priesthood of the believer that all Christians accept, but a priesthood beyond that, that has the authority to forgive sins and to offer up unbloody sacrifices according to the order of Melchizedek. Those things were there from the beginning. They were the air that the early church was breathing in. And here's the catch. If you say that the early church, whether within the time of the apostles or just after the time of the apostles, departed so far from the faith that they are, according to your own confessions, apostate, then Christ failed to preserve his church. But Christ said that he would preserve his church, that the gates of hell would not prevail against her. He said, "Lo, I am with you always, even unto the end of the world," and that the Spirit would be with the apostles to guide them into all truth. And the early church faced a lot of errors in practice, and errors in doctrine, and they faced them from the times of the apostles. But the truth prevailed, and the truth remained, and as the Apostle Paul said, the church is the pillar and foundation of the truth. And the earliest Christians where they looked to know where the truth was after the death of the apostles was with those bishops who had been ordained by the apostles, who were found faithful in faith and practice. And they passed down a specific doctrine and practice from bishop to bishop to bishop. And that includes a priesthood, and with it, the sacraments, the sacrifice of the Eucharist, baptism with the priest saying the words of consecration over the water, it being through the priest and his chrismating the baptized individual that the Holy Spirit comes upon them. That was how they told where the truth was and where the true church was. They relied on the priesthood. So yes, there were errors of doctrine and life that assailed the church over the centuries, but Christ fulfilled his promise. And we know where the exact successors of the bishops, going back to the apostles, are today. We have their lines. We have every bishop of Rome, from the Apostle Peter till today, man by man. As with any bishopric over 2,000 years, yes, not all of them were perfectly righteous men. Not all of them were perfectly orthodox. But Christ preserved his church. And the tradition that was passed down from the apostles survived. We have every bishop of Rome. We have every bishop of Alexandria, from Mark to Pope Tawadros II. We have every bishop of Antioch, from Peter to the present day. All the successors of Peter and of Ignatius. We have them. We have the perfect list of every bishop of Jerusalem. From James, the cousin of Jesus, to the present day. And what was said, as St. Irenaeus said, what was said by all of them in all places was the apostolic faith. And while some of those churches are sadly not in communion at the moment, all of the apostolic churches teach the same thing about the basics of the faith. They teach the same thing about the Nicene faith, and in reference to our topic under discussion, they teach the same thing about the priesthood, about the Eucharist as an unbloody sacrifice. That faith has been preserved. The church has been assailed by assaults. Bishops have even crept in who went against what had come before them, but the faith was preserved by that common belief and practice of all the bishops, the high priests of Christ, who all can trace back their line to the apostles, and all those bishops and priests who are in fellowship with, in union, sacramental Eucharistic union with the Bishop of Rome, with the bishops of Antioch, whether Eastern or Oriental, and with the Bishop of Alexandria, with the Bishop of Jerusalem. They all say one thing when it comes to there being a priesthood, when it comes to there being sacraments. So the priesthood was not a slow development. And I've heard this claim made a number of times, that the priesthood slowly developed. But I must say, I have not seen any evidence to show how it developed or what it developed into. Beyond people pointing out what everyone agrees on, that originally there was a bishop in each local church surrounded by the priests, and that later it became bishops became a regional thing. And then from there is extrapolated the idea that the whole priesthood was a slow development. But everybody agrees that we started out with one bishop in each local church and developed on from there. So that argument just doesn't hold water. There's no evidence to the contrary assertion. What we do have is from the earliest times there being a belief that there were priests who had authority on earth to forgive sins and offer sacrifices, and from the earliest times, from Clement of Rome, Ignatius of Antioch, Athenagoras, we have a belief in the unbloody sacrifice of the Mass. Where there's a sacrifice, there's a priest. So rest assured, friends, the apostolic churches, yes, we're broken right now. But we agree on way more than we disagree on. And we all have this in common: the priesthood of Christ, the priesthood according to the order of Melchizedek, that binds us to the early church and binds us back to the beginning. And you can rest assured that the priesthood was not a slow development, is not an aberration. The sacramental priesthood is a basic feature of the Christianity that Christ taught the apostles, and the apostles passed on to their successors. Have a blessed day.